Thank you, Jerry. It's a pleasure to be here. Yes, I am a member of this. Both my kids were bar mitzvah here. So I did find my way without any difficulty, I have to say. You know, if you study what the Nazis did, you find out that there's very little innovation in terms of the kinds of things they did. They simply, as it were, improved on the past, expanded quantitatively. There were genocides before the Nazis. There were massacres of humans before the Nazis. They improved on that, right? They raised the numbers. They focused all of the energies of a government on genocide in a way that no one had done before. And when it comes to the plunder of art, the same can be said. Two things can be said about it. One, that there was a lot of precedent. I'll come to that in a moment. And the other is there's also precedent for why one plunders art. Typically, the conquerors plunder the art of those they conquered in part, and think about the paradox of this, is to show how damn civilized they are. We love art, we love culture, which is why we plunder it. And so it becomes a kind of antidote to what we're actually doing, which is destructive, but we want to show that we appreciate creativeness. If you think historically all the way back, let's say, to the Assyrians, we have plunder. The first plunderer by name was a Roman general by the name of Lucius Mummius. And when the Romans first came to Corinth, and they came there to help out, because the Greeks at that point, in the late Hellenistic period, were very much, as they had been through most of their history, divided amongst themselves. And the Romans kind of were invited in to help adjudicate matters, and they'd come back later and they wouldn't leave. But at the time when they first came, it was to adjudicate, and to their credit, they did leave. Lucius Mummius, however, when he left, took with him a substantial number of Greek statues. Pausanias, the writer, the history writer, talks about this, and he says, and Lucius Mummius gave specific instructions to the company that insured the stuff he was taking back to Rome, that if any of these works, did you check with my agent, by the way? That if any of these works was damaged, that they would be replaced by works of equal weight. So like you and like me, Pausanias, tongue-in-cheek, is saying about Lucius Mummius, the barbarian, he's taking art to be civilized, but you can't just take art and become civilized. He's still a barbarian. He has no concept of the aesthetic value of the Greek statues that he's taking. He just thinks in terms of their weight. And if we follow history forward, of course, again and again and again, there are plunderers. The most notorious plunderer in the early modern era, of course, is Napoleon, who not only brought things back from Rome to Paris, but brought things back that the Romans had taken from Egypt to Rome and brought back to Paris, and he also brought things back from Egypt to Paris, and also things for Austro-Hungary and Germany and Russia and the like. And he kind of set a new standard with respect to the quality and quantity of plunder, but as in so many other things, the Nazis and Hitler exceeded that. Perhaps 1/5 of the available art in Europe was removed from its location into new locations during the Nazi period. And clearly one can understand, if one studies the beginnings of the Nazi plundering project, that their intention was to demonstrate how cultured and cultivated they were, while they were doing things that we don't typically associate, or we don't like to think that we associate with being cultured, cultivated, and civilized. And there was also precedent for the process of plunder, which would only become formalized as a process, formalized in the fullest sense, by 1941. But there was a whole lead up to that, as with so many other aspects of the Nazi process. So on the one hand, you have Hitler, who comes into power as Chancellor in 1933 within a year, the beginnings of a series of laws that have as their point and purpose, in the first case, to deprive Jews of the rights of citizens, and therefore the rights to own anything. So I don't just mean your Modigliani, I mean the silverware that you use to set your table with. You have no right to possess any of that. And in 1934, the first, they were called Jew auctions, took place, which is to say that works of art that had been forcibly purchased at a fraction of their value from Jews were then auctioned to, well, members of the Nazi Party. And there would develop a hierarchy as the plundering process became more developed that would begin with whatever the Führer wants, and beneath him the mucky-mucks such as Göring and Himmler and Goebbels and whatever they want, and then lesser mucky-mucks, and then the German museums. So you do understand that those oh-so-civilized museum directors and curators could not have been, and very much were involved in helping to facilitate this project, because they were thinking of the holes in their collections which now could be filled, and then lesser Nazis, and so on and so forth. There were the things that wanted, that they all wanted. There were the things that Hitler approved. There were the things that nobody wanted. There were the things that people wanted in spite of the fact that Hitler didn't approve them, like Göring, whose little cottage outside Berlin in Karenhall, as it was called, this expanded hunting lodge, would become jam-packed, not only with the sort of stuff that was approved by the Führer, but with the sort of stuff that was not. And so, as I'm sure you also know, during this period, the campaign to define what is proper art and what is not was also afoot, as seems to happen periodically in one fascist regime and the other. It's not, again, something that was unique to the Nazis. Stalin had decreed by 1934 that the only proper Soviet art would be Soviet socialist art, Soviet socialist realist art, excuse me. Nothing that fell out of that category would be permitted, could be created. You could be persecuted for creating it, or for trying to create it, or for hiding it, or for owning it. So, again, Hitler was not unique in this regard. But the whole category of what Himmler referred to as degenerate art was something that the Nazis were not interested in having around. So garbage like this, Picasso, which, as you can see, he doesn't know how to draw. He's showing this woman looking in a mirror, and it doesn't look like a woman looking in a mirror. It looks like a bunch of colors and lines. Or garbage like this, rock. You know, there's sort of a guitar down there. But this sort of material was regarded by the Nazi regime as inherently entartige Kunst, right? Degenerate art. And in fact, a massive exhibition at one point was done of degenerate art. And running across the street from it was an exhibit of proper art. And to the great astonishment, disappointment, and dismay, no doubt, of the Nazi Party, the degenerate art exhibition was just overflowing with crowds, day by day by day by day, and trickles were coming in to see the proper kind of art. Proper kind of art would include someone like Rembrandt. First of all, a nice northern European. Second of all, someone who works in a kind of figurative manner. But even Rembrandt was not across the board acceptable. For example, a painting like this, which you will recognize as Jacob with his, Isaac with Jacob and Esau, Hebrew Bible, too Jewish, out. Better stuff like this. So Van Ruysdael, who is an important 17th century landscape painter, his kind of work was acceptable, and by the way, his work is magnificent, but even works like this one by Hercules Sagers, another 17th century northern artist, but whose name is probably known to very few of you because he's not very prominent, because he's not of the quality of Van Ruysdael. The fact of the matter is, anything that offered nice landscapes or offered nice, heroic, smiling, happy, healthy-looking young people, that's the sort of stuff that the Führer liked. Göring wasn't so upset about Picasso's, but he didn't let the Führer know that he liked that sort of stuff. And if this kind of painting was what was to be preserved, and this is the kind of stuff that would be plundered as the Nazi regime expanded, not only was there the idea that this kind of art and this kind of art should be destroyed, but by 1943, the realization as the Nazi war machine was already that early starting to run in reverse, it was not moving forward, And one of the ironies that always strikes me about that is so much energy was devoted to destroying Jews when they could have redirected those energies toward the war effort, that they were constantly shooting themselves in the foot because of their obsession with killing Jews. So it goes, huh? But they realized that, you know, we might not like this stuff, but there are a lot of other people out there who do. So when by 1941, an organization known as the ERR was organized by a fellow named Alfred Rosenberg, that's the last R in ERR, who had been, by the way, the primary theorist for Hitler with respect to race. So the articulation of what distinguishes Aryans from Jews, from Gypsies, in terms of nose type and eye type and soul type, all of that, that was Rosenberg's scientific institute that came up with that. And he then shifts gears and he's put in charge as the Nazi curtain falls over so much of Europe, and as the rules that pertained to Germany now come to pertain beyond Europe to, well, in this case, primarily Jews, anywhere. So anywhere that the Nazis come to be in charge, Jews come to not be citizens, come not to have the right to own anything. This is, of course, along the way to developing a definitive kind of policy for Jews not having the right to live. First, you don't have the right to own, and eventually you don't have the right to live. You're familiar, of course, with Kristallnacht, and one of the interesting things about Kristallnacht, which is November 10th, 1938, is that Himmler was in charge of the SA that was in charge of this kind of an action. And as you know, it was fairly hooliganish violence against Jews all over Germany on that night. Dozens of Jews were killed, scores and hundreds were injured, homes, shops, synagogues, either severely injured or destroyed altogether. But Goering felt that this was not the way to go about it, and was able to prevail on the Fuhrer to let him take charge, have the SS instead of the SA be put in charge, and everything that, excuse me, I've got the names backwards. Goering had been in charge of the SA. It was Himmler now who put in charge, said, we can't have this kind of random, ugly, bloody violence. So if you were a Jew in Berlin, let's say on November 15th of 1938, you were safer walking in the street than you would have been a month before with respect to random anti-Jewish Nazi hooligan violence. Of course, the other side of that is that's because they're sitting down and coming up with a more systematic, cleaner plan for how more effectively to rid the world of Jews altogether and not just in random violence. And of course, that will be both a conceptual development and also a technological development. It's not efficient to just line them up in front of a pit and shoot them, and not all of them die, and some of them get away, and so on and so forth. If we could come up with some technology, and fortunately, World War I had developed gas technology used in warfare, and if we can just apply it, although it was a modification, it wasn't the kind of gas that was used in World War I. I know you're interested in this technical information. It was actually anti-insect, what do you call it, you know? Insecticide was developed as Zyklon B for the purposes of being more efficient. It's all about efficiency. So, coming back to the art. By the time the ERR was in place in 1941, of course, the Nazi program for the solution, the final solution to the Jewish problem is also taking its definitive shape. The doors are opening to all kinds of concentration camps, some of which will serve as slave labor camps, some of which will serve, like Theresienstadt, as a kind of holding cell on the way to one of the 6 camps specifically designated as extermination camps, and so on. A far-flung kind of system, and as far-flung as that system was, the system of art plunder was also. And it was far-flung in different ways. It was far-flung not only because wherever the Nazis went, it came with them, but also because of the willingness of those who needed to cooperate in order to make it efficient to cooperate. As you know, the Holocaust is about Nazis and Jews. It's not about Germans and Jews, because there are plenty of Germans who weren't Nazis, and there were plenty of Nazis who were not Germans. In fact, even the German Nazis were astonished when in 1938 they came into Austria, right, what's called the Anschluss. And until about a decade and a half ago, the Austrians were fond of saying, we were the first victims. By about a decade and a half, they began to acknowledge that actually we embraced Hitler more warmly. He was, after all, one of us. He was an Austrian. We embraced him more warmly than the Germans did. And we treated our Jewish citizens far more egregiously in the everyday sense than the Germans did. The Germans didn't come up with the idea of making old Jewish men and women use toothbrushes to clean the cobblestones, to humiliate them. That was an Austrian innovation. One of the first aspects of Nazi efficiency, which arrived with the Anschluss, was the notion of having every Jew or anyone who had any kind of Jewish connection fill out what were called property census forms, in which you listed everything that you possessed. So not just cultural property, not just your paintings and your drawings and your statues, but any real estate, your automobile if you had one, everything from, well, from silverware to sculpture was included in this. And two comments about that, which when my colleague Mark Mazerovsky and I spent months in the archives here studying these documents. One was the way in which it's so clear that the Austrian Jewish community had no idea what was coming, because anti-Semitism had always been a part of Vienna, had always been a part of Austria, even as when and where the Jews were as prominent as they were, for example, at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, with respect to culture and with respect to all the things we think of in the positive when we think about Vienna and the Austrians at the end of the 19th, the beginning of the 20th century. We may or may not get to Klimt, for example, and there you have an example of Jewish patronage, because Adele Lachbauer, of course, was from a Jewish family that patronized an artist like Klimt. But you had people like anyone from Freud to Herzl and back again, who are part and parcel of this extraordinary web of culturati, Jewish among and interwoven with non-Jews. But that didn't mean there wasn't anti-Semitism. The first time Karl Lueger ran for mayor in 1897, his platform was essentially anti-Semitism. So virulent was it that he was elected that Franz Joseph II, the emperor, would not confirm him as mayor. He had to tone it down the next time in order to actually become the mayor of Vienna. So the Jews didn't see what was happening as something that was all that different from what had happened before. And you can see it in two ways. You see it, first of all, in that every property census form I looked at, or almost every one, there's some real estate involved. Whether I own 6 factories or I own half of the apartment in which I live, everyone seemed to own something with respect to real estate. You don't buy real estate if you have the slightest inclination that you're going to have to pick up stakes and move fast, because you know you can't liquidate real estate. So this was a community that felt itself very much entrenched within the larger Viennese and Austrian world. And secondly, so many of them who owned art, most of what they owned was third-rate Austrian nationalist art that every Austrian who's a nationalist would have on his walls. Names of painters you wouldn't ever have heard of because they were third-rate, but everyone owned them. They were so Austrian, they owned these paintings too. And a second element to this second feature is, and they were so Austrian, they filled out the forms regardless of where they were. There were forms that I read that had been filled out in New York, in Istanbul, in places where clearly, does it matter? I'm not back in Vienna anymore, but I fill it out because that's what I'm supposed to do, so that's what I do. And little did they realize that what they were filling out was an early version of their own death certificates. So, where the Jews, of course, were concerned, the notion of destruction was not just destroying Jews, it was destroying Judaism itself. And at the same time, another kind of paradox, the idea was to let the world know what we have done on its behalf. in destroying this far-flung, wealthy, nefarious, dangerous Jewish culture. And so, as much of what was gathered was to be destroyed, at a certain point, the Nazis, as a kind of concomitant of this, thought we should make, well, actually two very, very large museums. One was going to take place in Hitler's hometown, which would be the largest art museum the world had ever seen. And he doted on these plans with Albert Speer for years, literally for years. Even just before the end, you still see photographs of him like a kid playing with blocks or Legos, you know, peering over the architectural model of the whole town that has been reconfigured and centered on his museum. And on the other hand, a museum of the defunct people, which they decided fairly simply located, would be located in Prague. Prague, which had a very long history. So the Jewish quarter of Prague, with its 6 or 7 synagogues, this is a detail, you're looking up toward the roof of the interior, past the parochet of the Altneu Shul, the oldest synagogue in not only in Prague, but the oldest synagogue in continuous use in Europe. So it dates from the 12th century. And of course it has this magnificent old cemetery that is similarly about 1,000 years old, with gravestones piled on gravestone. And what the Nazis did was ingather from throughout Bohemia and Moravia, the area which is essentially now the Czech lands and Slovakia, endless and endless and endless and endless arrays of, well, here you have, of course, yads from Torahs. Here you have Kiddush goblets by the thousand. Also, textiles like various parochets, katorets, all the sorts of things that are part and parcel of life in the synagogue, life in the home, knives, rollers for, where this, 'tis the season, matzah making, right? That's why you've got all those little pinions. And I'll come back to that in a moment. Okay, so this enormous ingathering of objects, specifically Jewish ceremonial objects, in order to create this museum of this defunct people as a counterbalance to the museum that Hitler hoped to create of the kind of art that he approved. 1/5 of the world's cultural property, because ultimately the plunder extends beyond just dealing with Jews. They are a particular focus, and there are particular Jewish collectors who or owners who are a particular focus. Obviously the Rothschilds, who in spite of their wealth became victimized by this. Someone like Paul Rosenberg, no relation to Alfred Rosenberg, a very important a French gallerist who survived the war, and I'll get back to that later on, until 1958, was trying to refine the stuff that he'd hidden, and who had taken his most important works, and they were Modigliani's, and they were Picasso's, and they were Braque's, and Chagall's, and all that sort of stuff, and put them in a bank vault in the south of France in Libourne. But it didn't take the SS long to come knocking on that bank door, because someone who said something to someone, because there was an enormous web of cooperation, or should I say collaboration, and that involved gallerists, and that involved museum directors and curators, and it involved all kinds of people, some of them the kinds, well, you would expect that they'd be involved in this, but also the kinds of people of whom one might suppose that they wouldn't be involved in this sort of thing, because their moral quotient, their MQ somehow would be higher, and clearly not. It wasn't just a matter of, if you don't help me out, I'm going to kill you. It was, I'd love to help you out. And by the way, could I get a cut? So you had this web, and you also, you can't make this happen without, I think, 3 things going on besides the Nazi machine. One are the collaborating web all over the place. The other is you have to have blind, deaf, mute purchasers available. For example, in the art market in New York, who, when stuff comes up, can pretend that they don't know where it's coming from, that they have no idea that it could have been plundered. So you need an art market. And the other thing is, you need intermediaries, particularly during time of war, in order to get stuff that the Nazis don't want, so they're not taking it back to Berlin or to Vienna for the purposes of those museums, but it's stuff they don't want that they'd rather sell because they can buy armaments with the funds that are generated. How are they going to get from the places from which you plunder them to New York and to Buenos Aires and places of that sort? Well, you have what are called neutrals. So you have Portugal, you have Sweden, you have, above all, I heard someone say it, Switzerland. That also, until about 15 years ago, claimed that we held off the Nazis because we were so hardy and our soldiers were so good and they so afraid to come through the Alps. Oh yeah. No, you played a very important role for the Nazis. You were willing to take in their gold, you were willing to take in their gold and transfer it somewhere else, you were willing to do these bank accounts which nobody can get access to, so that Nazis who after the war were going somewhere else, they have access to their money. And boy, were you willing to deal with art. Still are. Something that's been in Switzerland for 5 years, its provenance, its ownership history is expunged. So that's why you also have Italian antiquities that end up at the Getty, or the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and the provenance says Switzerland, unknown collector, because they were stolen from a site in Sicily, and the network got it up to Switzerland, and then it sits there, quietly, in a vault, for 5 or 7 or 8 years, and now suddenly it finds itself out on the auction table, where its provenance simply says Switzerland. Well, where the art was concerned, this was essential. So you have trains filled with artworks going, let's say, from Paris, back through Switzerland, and then from Switzerland out to wherever they end up going out to. So this process is a pretty astonishing one. And by the end of the war, things are pretty much a mess. This, of course, is an image of a rabbi, Rabbi Plaut, who is looking at some of the piles and piles of Torah scrolls, which, as you can see, were just tossed. That's degenerate. Or in this case, the slide is a little bit dark, but you may recognize a Leonardo da Vinci there, which is being guarded by Allied troops. Right there. The girl with the ermine, it's from Krakow. Okay, it's still in Krakow, in the Krakow Museum, because the Nazi sense of what should happen to whom was, well, Jews and Gypsies, extermination, no question about that. Slavs, any that die along the way, that's fine, but ultimately they will be the slave population for the Aryans after this is over and we have conquered everything. So anything that was Slavic, per se, culturally, was likely to have been destroyed, but anything that was Italian, French art that was in Slavic lands or anywhere else, they wanted to preserve. And of course, at the end of the war, this is how things happened. There was, in the first place, an organization, a commission established by the French, the British, and the Americans, a Trilateral Commission. You all know its popular name now, Monuments Men. And in particular, they operated through Paris to try and relocate stuff that had been stashed, stolen, stashed, and so on and so forth. The material, and much of it came from France, and parenthetically I might point out that the plunder that came from France would be justified by Hitler according to the following rationale. Napoleon stole from us. We're simply taking back what he stole from us. There's an interesting sort of parallel rationale to the Soviet decision to plunder anything they could from the Germans without worrying about whether the Germans had had it or whether the Germans had plundered it from someone else, on the grounds that we have lost, which is true they did, more than anyone else to the Germans in terms of the millions of Russians who perished and the treatment of them by the Germans, that this is reparations. And as you know, it would be not until the beginning of this century that the Soviets would start to open up with respect to what they had stashed in the basement of the Hermitage, for example, that had come from Germany but didn't originate in Germany but came from elsewhere, which makes for all kinds of interesting questions with respect to plunder. So Schliemann steals all that gold from what was Turkey, brings it back to Berlin. It ends up in the Soviet Union, which is now Russia. So do the Germans have the right to ask that back from the Russians when actually it should go back Turkey, shouldn't it? How do we adjudicate this? In the immediate aftermath of the war, until about 1951, there was a group of intrepid researchers, many of them art historians and curators from this country, the so-called monuments men, who spent a lot of time working on this. Their ability to deal with it was facilitated, particularly where Paris was concerned, by Rose Valland. She is the character who is, I don't know why, except George Clooney maybe didn't like the name, who is represented as this female figure who sort of kind of, but didn't end up having an affair with, what's his name, James. She, indeed, that is a real character who kept, while she was working at the Jeu de Paume and at the Louvre, dealing with all the stuff that was coming in to then be sent out, was keeping a very careful mental record, and every night when she went home, she wrote it all down, she wrote it all down. She was only member of the Louvre staff that was kept on staff because she seemed to be so harmless, so the Nazis weren't worrying about her. But that little notebook that she was represented as giving him, that's true. That is indeed what happened. What isn't true is it wasn't 5 or 6 guys. There were several hundred. What is also true, however, is that whatever the number was, there weren't enough of them, and they weren't kept on the job long enough. And so what fundamentally happened was that there was a series of what are called collecting points. For example, Wiesbaden, where stuff would be gathered in, and then what they would try and figure out is which countries did this come from. And fundamentally, what their goal was to make sure it got back to the country from which it had been plundered. But they didn't, because they couldn't worry about, once it gets into the country, from whom it had been taken. Did it come from this museum or that private collection? If it came from that private collection, is there a member or are there members of that family still alive to whom it should go back? Or what if not? And when the Trilateral Commission's time was up, when the Monuments time was up, more or less stuff had gotten back to countries, but that didn't mean it got back to the places from which it had come. So for example, there were about 2,200 works of art in France that were not claimed and were simply absorbed into the French collections. In fact, one of the people who saw that that happened was a monuments man who happened to be French. And not all the monuments men were good guys, because there were several of them who were lining their own pockets with works of art, rather than doing what they were supposed to do. So that's another little detail that, if you just saw the movie or read the book, you might not realize. They weren't all heroes, although many of them were. So I don't want to argue at all with that, but there were some who were not. Anyway, so about 2,200 works are still out there in France, absorbed into the French museums. And there's a little mark on them that indicates that they're unclaimed art, but only someone who knew what that meant would know that. And there were a couple of interesting sort of complications. Again, the reason my colleague and I were studying all these property census forms from Vienna by the thousands was because Christie's, which by then had been, Sotheby's, which by then had been burned several times by our intrepid research when they put stuff on auction, which turned out to be Nazi plundered art, and they were tired of that. They actually paid us to go through all this stuff, so if material that came up for auction could be reasonably assumed to have been plundered by the Nazis, that they wouldn't put it up for auction. They'd say to the consignor, well, we can't deal with this, or we've got to open this up to find out where it came from. And one of the problems, of course, is, so if it belongs to me, right? And my remaining heir, because I died during the war, or even after the war, is a daughter. She marries, so now she's got a different last name. So first of all, when she went to the collecting point, do they believe that she is the legitimate heir because she's got a different last name from mine? The more so 50 years later, if it's up for auction, whatever the work of art is at Christie's. So another kind of complication, all these complications. There's another complication, which is that the whole issue dies by 1951, 1952, for well nigh 40 years. First of all, in this country, by 1951, 52, I know you're all too young to remember that period, but our erstwhile allies, the Soviets, have become our prime focus. Just want to, so this doesn't burn. Our primary, that on so it cools off. Our primary focus and concern, of course, are the Soviets, the communists. And as you know, there were plenty of former Nazi scientists who not only came into this country, but came into this country leapfrogging over standard immigration procedures if they were perceived to be of potential use, either with respect to weaponry or as time moved on with respect to space in our competition with the Nazis. Frenner von Braun, of course, is the most famous. This was called Operation Paperclip. Operation Paperclip was the name of the policy of the State Department to allow that to happen. So this was not an atmosphere in which people are overly worried about the Nazis when they're already shifting on to worrying about the communists. Here's a quick question. Who won last year's NCAA men's tournament? See, you've already forgotten. It was Louisville. Okay? Well, you were too slow. Whoever said that, say it quickly. So we, in particular, as you know, as a people, we tend to move very quickly toward the future and not spend a lot of time thinking about the past. And in fairness, think about the Holocaust survivors. Do they want to ruminate about the most horrific period of their lives? They want to move on with their lives. So there's a kind of perfect storm of, let's not worry about this stuff anymore, let's just move forward. And meanwhile, in the 50s, you've got galleries like Sotheby's and Christie's and others, where they can't not know, in a relatively small world, where things have come from, and the likelihood is where they really have come from. But they're just moving right along. The art market is just burgeoning. And it's a concatenation of issues that kind of ends up bringing this subject into the focus, which it completely lost by the end of the 40s. Think about Jimmy Carter and the 70s. Think about the campaign to create the U.S. Holocaust. Well, should it be a memorial or should it be a museum? It's both. And the impetus behind that, which was not entirely, but in part, his perceived relationship with the Jewish community of America, which he wanted to improve. That museum, the plans for that museum kick in around 1977. I skipped a step, 2 steps. In 1961, Adolf Eichmann goes on trial in Jerusalem. And for the first time in 15 years, really, the Holocaust is front and center. I remember it, and you probably all do as well. It was on our TV screens, even in abbreviated form, every week. In parts of the world, it was on every night. And 6 years later, on the eve of the June War, it looked as if Israel was going to be annihilated. Do you remember? Do you remember? Oh, deja vu all over again. Didn't that just happen 20 years ago? The world shrugged its shoulders, what can we do? So the interest in the Holocaust starts to gather speed in the 60s, the 70s. Carter, by 1991, the Holocaust Museum has actually opened, and Lynn Nicholas, a few years later, publishes her important book called The Rape of Europa, which is the first accessible representation of this whole picture that I've tried to squeeze into a half hour that she gets 300 or 400 pages to talk about. And she's able to do that because the archives have become open in a way that they had not been until the beginning of the 90s. They were sealed. 2 years later, Hector Feliciano writes in French the book, The Lost Museum, the Musée Perdu. It's translated a year later into English. He focuses on a handful of specifically French Jewish families and their collections, including, for example, Paul Rosenberg. And frankly, in 1997, in September, the museum that I was still directing sponsored an all-day conference on this topic. Stu Eisenstadt, who was then the Undersecretary of State, came as our keynote speaker because I'd had dinner with him at my board chair's house. He didn't know anything about art. He knew about the bank accounts, he knew about the gold, he knew about insurance policy, he didn't know anything about plundered art. I said, no, this is the last really big page that's got to be turned. He came as our keynote. A year later, the Washington Conference in '98 that he convened involved 46 different countries, including the Russians, who all agreed to certain principles with respect to opening up their information about what was what so that this idea could be pursued further. And of course, it's kind of gone like this. Every time there's something extraordinary that happens, like the Gerlit case, which was on in the New York Times, again, just a day or two ago, his 12 or 1,300 works of art, gathered mostly by his father, who was half Jewish, but who was one of Hitler's primary ingatherers of art, interestingly. And who knows, because we don't know yet, how much of that collection is plundered from different families. I saw another subset of that story just yesterday, which is that one of the paintings, it's a Matisse, was claimed immediately by Lane Rosenberg, who is Paul Rosenberg's daughter. The first case that my colleagues and I worked on was a Rosenberg case. It was a painting that was at the Seattle Art Museum that had been purchased by Prentice Bladell and his wife Jenny, a timber magnate from the Pacific Northwest, in the mid-50s, from a prominent gallery in New York. And I saw all the correspondence. Jenny Bladell is saying, who owned it? Well, we don't know. Our consigners don't like to let us know. You know, it was on exhibition in Stockholm. Maybe it was a Swedish collector. It was clearly prevarication. It was clearly obfuscation. It was clear that that gallery could not, in the small museum and gallery world of the mid-1950s, not know at the least that it had come from Europe and been plundered, and probably knew that it was from Rosenberg's collection because, you know what, until his dying day, he was all over the place with letters to everyone in the art world. Have you seen these works? Have you seen these works? And it was part of a group of 12, one of which had been found. The Yellow Christ by Gauguin, that is in the Albright Knox. The then director had helped him find it, so they got it for a fraction of its actual value. So to make a long story short, Bladell had placed it in his will to go to Seattle Art Museum. His grandson was at a party in Chicago and was leafing through, it was a copy of Hector Feliciano's book. And there he sees that Matisse, that's Grandpa and Grandma's painting that Hector has there as still missing. And the long and the short of it is, my colleague and I, Mark and I, did research. We had to demonstrate two things. One was that this is the Matisse in question, because he did a number of Matisses, a number of paintings which are rather similar with similar titles. And that it wasn't a painting that, because he lived till 1958, he had reclaimed and resold. And we were able, from all the correspondence and documentation, to prove that. And so Seattle Art Museum ended up returning it to Elaine Rosenberg. Well, one of the paintings in the Gerlit collection, another Matisse, has been claimed by her. And then I read another family, but they're not saying who, has said, no, it's ours. So that will be another complication. There is always a complication. The complication may be that sort of a complication. The complication may be, there's a claim right now, and then when I finish this little anecdote, I'm going to open things up to questions. There's a small Pissarro that is out in Oklahoma. You may have read about this. And there's a claim, her name is Renée Bloch, she's from France. And it was part of her father's collection. And her father also survived the war. It had also made its way into Switzerland. He brought a case to get it back in when he tracked it down, it was 1950, I think, 6. And the Swiss court said, well, statute of limitations, it's up. It's been more than 5 years. You can't have it. And then it sort of disappeared. He died. And it reappeared because another American gallery that had it had sold it over the 25-year period. They sold to actually a Jewish family from Oklahoma a series of 25 works of art between about 1955 and 1985. And they gifted the whole thing to Oklahoma State and its art museum. And it came into their collections about 2001, 2002. About 2008, a curator in Indiana happens to be doing some other research and notices a couple of paintings from that collection which have questionable provenances, calls Oklahoma State, says, you really need to check into this stuff. Apparently they did not a thing. And then Renée Bloch somehow got wind of this painting, and she, of course, filed suit about a year and a half ago. And what's interesting here is the entire state of Oklahoma is up in arms against the museum, against its director, against the university, which is standing fast saying, we won't return it, it's ours. So they're spending more money than it's worth, because it's a small Pissarro. It's not, you know, it's probably worth $700,000, $800,000. I mean, $700,000 or $800,000. It's not, you know, a $9 or $90 million kind of painting. And they're spending more than it's worth. They're getting all kinds of adverse publicity for himself, themselves, and themselves. And it's just astonishing. So that's a different kind of complication. We won't give it up. We got it legitimately. Well, yes, you did get it legitimately, but the chain of transmission was not legitimate. One last word. Continental law with respect to possession is this. If I bought from you something that you stole, I bought it from you in good faith, it's mine. Tough luck for the guy from whom you stole it. In the United States and in England, it doesn't work that way. Bad, faulty or false ownership doesn't pass. So if I bought something from you which you stole, and the guy from whom you stole it, even if it was 3 guys back, comes up and says it's mine, I don't have a simple case, well, I bought it in good faith, therefore it's mine. If he can prove that it was stolen, then he's going to end up with it. This is why we have to do all that title search stuff with our cars, with our houses that we pay for, right? It's exactly for that reason. We don't have that where art is concerned. And of course, we don't need it because museums and galleries and directors and curators are, of course, so pure. And they are the keepers of culture. They are the guardians of our bastions of civilization, that we won't have those kinds of problems. Indeed. I open things up to questions. Anyone? Yes, ma'am. No, not in New York, in Berlin. His name is Cornelius Gurlitt, G-U-R-L-I-T-T. Not 400, 14. Somewhere, I've heard the number 1280, I've heard the number 1381, somewhere between 1250 and 1400. Anyway, who's counting among friends? From Berlin. His father was a gallerist, and he was the personal collector, or one of the personal people who went out to find stuff for the Führer. So it is not necessarily the case that the collection that he amassed, that then went to his son, who is now 81 years old, is plundered. It's more than likely that at least part of it is. And of course, the only way to determine that is if it's studied carefully. 2 further comments, if you'll permit me. Comment 2, in reverse order, because I like to do things out of order. Comment 2 is, to my knowledge, the committee that has been appointed by the Germans to deal with this is not a committee that I think is likely to be as expert or as objective as they need. So I'm a little bit, shall we say, disturbed by that. That was point 2. Point 1 is that, how did this come to light? Gurlitt, who seems to have pretty much not held a job in the course of his adult life, loves this art. He lived in a relative, it was his mother's apartment, he lived with her, she died, he lived alone with all of these paintings. A lot of them, you know, stashed behind curtains, because how much wall space do you have in a small apartment, right? And he'd switch them out. Every so often, when he needed money, he would go over the border into Switzerland or France, where he must have had some connections, and he'd sell something. And one time, about 10 years ago, so by the way, notice how long it took for this to surface as an issue. 10 or 11 years ago, he was coming back from abroad, and at a kind of random border check, he had about 10,000 euros in his pocket. And the border authorities thought that was strange. He had no real explanation for why he had 10,000 euros in his pocket. And they worried about tax evasion. So they got a warrant to go search his apartment, and that's when all this stuff came out. But it took them a decade to let the world know that this trove had been located. And now it's in the news. Yes? Oh, sir.
Is it an international issue now? Because, you know, you're saying the people in Berlin, you don't think of the death, but is it confined to Germany?
Confined in which way to Germany?
To document?
Well, my feeling is that it shouldn't be. It is an international issue, because the collection is international. And the likely victims, if part of it was plundered, from whom the stuff would have been plundered, are by no means likely to be confined to Germany. And there has been a lot of, personally, I've been interviewed several times by different media, and one of the questions that I was being asked by a French interviewer was, how involved ought the French to be? And I said, well, they should be, but the French also have to be very careful because they've got some of their own kitchen scullery to do. The lawyer for René Bloch, who is French but lives in New York and is a lawyer in both, jurisdictions, his family has been trying to pursue a collection that belonged to them of fine furniture from the era of Louis XIV, 15, 16, for about 10 years. And they've met with the stone wall on the part of the French. So it is, even in that sense, international. And of course, it is an issue that I have personally spent about a dozen years trying to, concerning which I've tried to generate a more positive response from some of my museum colleagues here. And some have been right on board from the beginning, and others continue, like the former director of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, whose name I shall not say, who consistently, to the end of his tenure, was very, he didn't understand why Americans should want, whether it's Nazi plundered art or whether it's Italian antiquities, to leave our museums to go back whence they came. My answer is, well, because they were stolen. Isn't that a good enough reason? And when he finally worked out a deal with the Italians because the pressure was on, it was because the pressure was on, because he knew or feared that the Italians would stop lending things to American museums if he didn't work out a deal. And he was hailed. And I thought, fine, but he did the right thing, but not for the right reason. Yes?
I read that the commission that's going to look into the Ehrlich collection only has a year to do its work.
Yes, that's the other thing. The commission to do the Ehrlich collection, according to what I've also read, is they have a year to do their work. That's impossible.
What will happen?
We spent 6 months on that Matisse. Okay? Now, it doesn't necessarily take that long, but a year to do that kind of research, methinks that there's something a little bit sniffy about this. Yes, ma'am?
Have all the collection points been closed down at this point? And
They were closed down by
if
1951.
so, what was done with what was left unclosed?
They simply went back to the countries from which they could be deduced to have been taken.
And everything was
Well,
somewhere.
sometimes there was a notorious Yugoslav who came and claimed to be representing the Yugoslavian government and was given a whole trove of stuff, and it turned out he was neither Yugoslavian nor from the government. So they were so eager. One of the documents that I was studying collection point stuff in the archives was where the American in charge, it was a captain so-and-so, the form that is filled out by the person who is taking the stuff away essentially says, I, the captain, the American military man, I fulfilled my obligation, I've handed it over. So it seems that they were more eager to get it off of their hand, off of my desk and onto yours, and not worrying about yours, whether yours is the right desk. And in fairness, they're understaffed, and their time is too short.
To what extent is the availability of the internet affected the kind of work you do in the whole process?
The internet, in some respects, has helped, because more and more stuff is out there or is able to be out there, and more stuff can be located quickly. For example, and this can be for better and for worse, most major collections, for example, the National Gallery of Art here, but other collections elsewhere as well, have in the last 10 years made an increasing effort to put their stuff all on their website so that it is available, at least for someone who knows how to look or is looking for something, to find in a way that would not have been without the internet as easily accessible. Sometimes that can be a deception rather than a reality. About 11 years ago, actually precisely 11 years ago, I got a call and I was flown to Vienna to spend a day at the Leopold Museum, another controversial collection, and to look at their stuff, and they announced in their press release shortly thereafter that we had come to an agreement where the Holocaust Art Restitution Project, of which I was a co-founder and I'm the director, president, whatever it's called, was going to be doing provenance research for them. I never heard a word back from him, from the chairman of their board. About 6 or 7 months later, I said, what's going on? He said, oh, well, we decided we were just going to put everything out on our website. And therefore, if people have claims, they will find their works on our website, and we don't need to do, therefore, to hire a researcher. So they made the claim because it made them look good, but I doubt, having met Dr. Leopold and his wife at the time, that they were in good faith going to put everything out on the website with all the available information so that someone, with or without the expertise, could or could not find what they're looking for. So yes, definitely it's changed things for the most part positively, but it also has opened up the door to certain deceptions where you think it's helping and it's actually harming. Yes, ma'am.
I have
3 questions for the price of one.
Number one, the art that you showed as examples from the Jenner show.
You would never want a Picasso, right?
No, but in 1940, that might not. I think it was degenerate everywhere. That was really.
Well, not really, because when Rosenberg was already before in the middle of World War I, when his gallery was championing Picasso and Braque and Matisse, there were buyers. There were buyers. There were plenty of people who would have thought that. They were avant-garde, but there were people who were very much interested in that. Well, nonetheless, right? Yeah.
My other 2 questions are interesting. You were the director of the Flux.
Yes.
Museum.
Yes.
Was that her museum? What's happened to that collection? What is
It was the National Jewish Museum under the roof of B'nai B'rith. And when I left, or was forced to leave by the B'nai B'rith organization in 1998 because they didn't want the museum flourishing to the extent that it was, to be brutally frank about this, the museum gradually folded back into itself and has now disappeared. B'nai B'rith exists in offices now. They sold their building where the museum had been housed. They're in offices, and for a while they had cases, and they may still have cases in their offices, with some of their artifacts. Or it's in storage, or I don't know.
Well, now, my bigger question is this. This is a very interesting combination of religion philosophy, ownership, law, military history, art history. How did you get interested in it?
Oh, how did I get interested in this?
What's your background? I think authentication.
I studied classics and philosophy. It's too long a story for one afternoon, but I ended up in Cleveland for 10 years, where I ended up with 2 teaching jobs, one at Cleveland State in art history, and my art history had come out of the fact that I taught myself at a time when I was asked to do lectures at the Metropolitan Museum of Art because I had been working with some slides there, anyway. And I was teaching what was then called the Cleveland College of Jewish Studies. So the 2 areas that I mainly taught and started to teach and write and lecture in, which are areas of art history and areas of theology, are areas that I didn't formally study. But of course I brought to the table my background in classics and philosophy and other things. And I'm just interested in a lot of things. So, sort of a natural kind of interweave, I suppose, to be brief.
But it's really interesting crossover.
Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Assuming the book amendment is correct, I think of the salt mines.
Yes.
And the documentation.
Yes.
of the material that ended up in the salt mines.
Yes.
Which a lot of it did come from Friends Museum.
Right.
Were those pieces of art actually returned to the people that?
The stuff that was found, of so much of it in those salt mines, some of it, yes. So the stuff that was found in the salt mines that are referenced in Monuments Men and other places as well. Lynn Nicholas's book talks about that stuff. That's real. Where did that stuff end up? Did it go back whence it had come? And some of it did. There was an extraordinary trove of 11 priceless ceremonial objects from Germany that ended up in a small town not far from Dallas, Texas, because a GI by the name of Tom Joe Meador kept sending this stuff home in shoeboxes and stashed in his closet when he got home, and he'd take this stuff out every so often to show to friends. But when he died of cancer, his brother and sister, going through his things, found this incredible stuff. And they brought it to a dealer, a local dealer in Dallas, who offered them, you know, a few $100 for each piece, which are worth each of them a few $100,000. And they were smart enough to think, But when they decided to go bigger, they got exposed. And there was a book written by Bill Honan, who used to write for the New York Times, William Honan, on this. Several of the pieces have disappeared, maybe forever, of those 11. Several of them went back to Germany, sold to Germany by the brother and sister. And several of them ended up in the long run being forced back to Germany. But it was not easy. The Texas courts were far more inclined to favor the sister and brother because they're Texans, they're Americans, and screw the Germans, right? Than because they had been stolen, that they should go back. So the stuff from the mines, some of that stuff ended up here, and some of it has gone back to wherever it had come. So it didn't necessarily come from Germany, it could have come from France, as you said, and elsewhere. But a lot of it went back to where it needed to go back to. Right. But she, of course, was only documenting what came from France and really from French collections. And in that particular salt mine, a lot of the material was from churches and things. And that was stuff she would not have had access to document. But on the other hand, if you're from that church, you realize, oh my God, that was our altarpiece, you know. So a lot of it did go back to where it needed to. Not that I know of. Maybe what you're thinking of is the following. As far as I know, Hitler's art is not stored at the National Gallery of Art. Oh, you mean his paintings and drawings? That he drew? I think not. That's not where they are. You might be confusing that, maybe, with, there was recently some new stuff about his art and him as a painter. And also there was a campaign at the end of the war for us to do what the Russians had been doing, which was, or the Soviets, which was to take some of that stuff and put it in our museums. And there was enough of a pushback against that as a kind of immoral, then that makes us no better than they, was the idea. So it didn't happen, but there was an exhibition of Nazi-plundered art shortly after the war that made the rounds here before going back to the various places in Europe. Maybe you've confuted those two ideas. But no, as far as I know, Hitler's paintings and drawings are not in our storage at all. I'm trying to remember where. As far as I know, it is in Germany. That stuff is mostly in Germany. I think it's in Berlin. Yes, ma'am.
I remember news coverage of a collection of Nazi propaganda art, which is held by one of the local primary.
Yes.
Maybe.
Oh, so maybe that's what you think of. There is a collection of, yes, of Nazi propaganda art, but that's different. Hitler was just doing landscapes and architectural renderings. Yes, ma'am.
The Nazis were meticulous.
Yes, they were.
Keeping records. I was curious if they kept records and where they destroyed these artworks and where they came from.
Right.
Did those
Keeping,
records
yeah.
just get destroyed?
The meticulousness of the Nazi record keeping. For the most part, we have those records, and that has facilitated the massive amount of stuff, just mind-boggling, that facilitated the return of many of the things that were returned. Every work of art was stamped one way or another by the Nazis, but not necessarily with as specific an information datum as, it came from Paul Rosenberg's collection, particularly if it was some no-name. Something that came from the Rothschilds is likely to be more carefully marked by them, or for that matter, Paul Rosenberg. But there are a lot of no-names who had a few paintings. of second tier quality, not first tier, and so on. So they didn't always do that. And of course, some of the stuff, one of the big questions is, does it have to have been simply stolen? You came in, you pulled it off my wall. What if you knocked on my door, which is what was happening in 1933, 34, 5, 6, 7, 8. You knock on my door and say, I really want that, whatever it is, that's hanging on your wall. And I am Mr. SS, and you're you, and I say, I want it. And I'll pay you $2 for it. You really don't have much choice but to say, sure, it's yours for $2. So I didn't plunder it from you, did I? I purchased it from you. And that issue also became an issue with respect to a number of cases where the German government ultimately determined that forced sales counted as plunder. And so there are a number of noteworthy cases where that happened. Yes?
How likely is it that some of the pieces that have always been reported as missing will someday turn up?
Oh, there's always the likelihood. There's always the possibility that things will turn up.
And Malaysian
because-
airline is
yeah.
about to be filed.
Once they find the Malaysian airliner, or at least its black box, then they're going to find all these works of art as well. And then we can have something new on the news. But it's possible. Things turn up in odd places. Yes?
Something just occurred to me that I never thought of before. When I grew up in Cleveland High School, and I went to Cleveland Art Museum. And in 1948, when I was a child, there was a collection of traveling exhibit
That was
called
it.
Berlin Masterpieces.
Mm-hmm.
Was that from?
I think that probably was what you saw there.
And
Yeah.
also, I was a student in the galleries there. We kids were allowed to take camp stools and go with crayons and paint over paintings. And I won a contest for the Berlin Masterpieces. I did a copy of Titian's Dogs,
Mm-hmm.
a basket for everybody.
I think that it's likely because this exhibition, Berlin Masterpieces, Cleveland Museum of Art, 1948, I would say almost certainly what you saw was that
I knew it was
collection going
before.
around.
Somehow these paintings were
Right.
available for exhibit in America.
Right.
They were going to go back to Berlin.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
No,
Yes, last question. The pressure is on.
You mentioned working with a colleague.
Yes.
And you referenced archives. Do you mean our American?
Yes. So
And
there
I
are
understood there were copies in our archives before returning them to Germany of Nazi records. And I wondered, talk about how meticulous they were, whether the records we have here in our national archives are helpful at all in this kind of search.
Well, there are different archives that are helpful in different ways. Yes, our archives are definitely a rich source. As you say, there were things that we had that were returned to Germany, but we photocopied first. But for example, when we were doing the research on those property census forms, we don't have those here. We had a colleague in Vienna who was photocopying from their archives those property census forms and then sending them to our archives here, and then we would go and research them there. So there's also been a certain amount of collaboration, which there was not earlier on. But there's stuff in our archives, there's stuff in Paris, in London, in Vienna, in Berlin, and odd, out-of-the-way places. My colleague went up to Winnipeg, because there's a little archive there, which for some reason has a collection of stuff by a guy named Max Stern, whose heirs, which are mainly Concordia College up in Canada, just recently received from, I think it was from the Germans, a series of paintings that had been part of his collection. But the point is, up in Winnipeg, there was an archive of material because that little museum and archive had some stuff from him. And so he went to check it out, and he actually found, after 3 days of research, this is not fun, it's boring, a little document which almost certainly would prove, regarding some stuff that we were otherwise looking at, that the then director of MoMA, who helped this guy, who would claim that he had no idea about stuff being plundered that he could not have not known, right? So you can find stuff in odd places. In my book that Bartleby Press published, and here's its publisher, Jeremy Kay, called The Ash and Rainbow, Essays on the Arts and the Holocaust, the opening part and the closing part is about this subject. All the rest of it is about different aspects of the arts and the Holocaust. So if you're interested, speak to him. He's the man. There are books over there. Buy my books. Jerry's going to buy everything that no one else buys. So give her a break. Thank you all very much.